Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Clean Water Lecture Series. My name is Rachel Wood, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving for the Department of Environmental Conservation as their BMP Verification Coordinator. This afternoon, we will hear from Helen Carr, the Nonpoint Source Coordinator for the Department of Environmental Conservation Clean Water Initiative Program. Helen will be presenting on the 5-year Nonpoint Source Pollution Management Plan approved by the EPA for Vermont. Also joining us today is my colleague Jordan Geller, the Lake Champlain Projects Manager for the Department of Environmental Conservation Clean Water Initiative Program. Jordan will be assisting me in monitoring the Q&A chat. Today's lecture will feature a 30-minute presentation from Helen with questions and answers at the end. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A chat. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. Before we jump into the presentation, I want to go over a quick Microsoft Teams tutorial. Your screen may look a little like this. To open and close the Q&A chat, use this button. To ask a question, just simply click here. When you ask a question, it will go to us privately first. This is a good way to communicate with us during the presentation if you're having any trouble at all. Once we receive a question, we can then publish it and it will be in the featured section. Other attendees can like a question if you also want it to be asked. Closed captioning is available for this event, and you can toggle it on and off using this button. To adjust volume using the screen, you can use this button. Now, if you're still having some troubles or need to troubleshoot anything, you can head over to Need Help. This will take you to the Microsoft Teams webpage that they can give some help with. Or you can just Q&A chat us, and we can try to help resolve the situation. And putting in a plug for our next lecture in January 7th, we are going to be hearing from Patrick Monks on the Stormwater 3-acre general permit. Keep an eye out for more information on how to attend this event. I will also post in the chat a link to a quick survey. We would love to get your feedback on how this presentation is going, anything that we can do to improve the experience. And I will put that in the chat for everybody to use. And I'll remind everybody at the end as well. Now I will hand it over to Helen Carr and her presentation on non-point source pollution.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I just wanted to thank Rachel for having me here at this lecture series. I'm excited, and I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I really appreciate it. Even though I realize some of you may probably have never heard of the Nonpoint Source Management Plan, I can assure you that before I started as the Nonpoint Source Coordinator last year, I had never heard of it either. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is to tell you why this is such an important document if you care about clean water in Vermont. Just want to make sure everything is working. Okay, as far as I can tell, everything's working. Okay, so what is non-point source pollution? Seems like a good place to start. I'll tell you what it's not. First of all, it's not point source pollution. Point source pollution comes from a single identifiable source, such as a wastewater treatment facility or some discharge from a discrete pipe, such as this photo here, as an example of a point source pollution. Now, point sources are a little bit easier to identify and they're a little bit easier to control. We can regulate wastewater treatment facilities. So that's in contrast to non-point source pollution, which can come from a variety of different sources. It's much more complex. It can come from developed lands, such as, suburban developments, city developments, roadways. All the kind of stormwater runoff from those areas can lead to non-point source pollution. There's also runoff from agricultural lands, such as croplands or animal feedlots. The runoff from stormwater there can also fall into our rivers and lakes, causing non-point source pollution as well. Even some forestry practices can lead to excess sediment and nutrients going into waterways. And then another thing that is you kind of maybe wouldn't think about is the modification of some of our rivers and lakes and shorelands can actually cause disequilibrium, changing the habitat, changing the equilibrium of an ecosystem, which can increase the pollution in those areas. So it's a bit of a more complex beast. A lot of different pollutants can be associated with non-point source pollution. And I will get into a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. Okay. Why does Vermont have a non-point source management plan? Well, the short answer is it's required by EPA, but of course that's not the whole story. The Federal Clean Water Act, established in 1972, was actually amended in 1987. And in those amendments, the Section 319, which is called the Nonpoint Source Management Program section, was added to the Clean Water Act. And Section 319 addresses the need for greater federal leadership to help focus state and local non-point source efforts. Under Section 319, states, territories, and tribes can receive grant money that supports a wide variety of activities, including technical assistance, financial assistance, education, training, technology transfer, demonstration projects, and monitoring. So this is a federal program that Vermont participates in, and kind of as part of that, EPA asks for a 5-year comprehensive plan to be developed by each of the states that are granted this money. And that plan is meant to describe how the state's identifying and addressing non-point source pollution. The plan covers 5-year time span, but the EPA also requires an annual report back to them each year, describing kind of the progress that we're making with this plan. So as the state of Vermont, how do we use those funds? Vermont's a little bit special, but we get some money from EPA. We use that money directly to provide funding for our staff, and our staff, a lot of the staff that receive the EPA funding are in the Clean Water Initiative program, which is my program within the Department of Environmental Conservation. And they actually are the support systems for all of the grant funding, for many of the grant funding programs that we have in the Clean Water Initiative program. So we have multiple funding programs. They address multiple sectors of non-point source pollution. Overall, millions of dollars, millions of state dollars have actually been invested in clean water each year, and they support clean water projects. So this is kind of an important piece of how we get to do all of the funding and the grant programs that we get to do, is due to some of this help that we get from EPA. Okay, so we didn't start from scratch. We did just complete the plan, but we based it on the previous version of the plan. So that version was from 2015, I believe. That was the 2015 plan. So that kind of has just expired. We took that old plan, we looked at it, and kind of outlined any updates that needed to be made to it, what was new, what's happened in the last 5 years, what do we need to update. And kind of the second step of that process was a lot of collaboration needed to happen between our core team. We had a core team of 4 or 5 people in the water investment division that worked together to kind of pull this new version of the plan together. But of course, we didn't do it alone. We had input from various different agencies, different DEC departments, or different agency departments in ANR, and also Agency of Agriculture, Farm and Markets, the Drinking Water Groundwater Protection Division, and we also had some input from EPA as well on some of our drafts. So huge collaboration effort, interdepartmental and interagency effort was needed to put this plan together. We kind of compiled it, reviewed, finalized it, and we were able to submit it to EPA for approval in this September of this year. So just not too long ago. And so yeah, that's why this is a new and exciting document that we have to work from. Great. So thinking about the plan, what were kind of some of the main points that were updated in the plan? If we think back to the past 5 years of clean water policy in Vermont, a lot has changed. Some of the notable things that we've included were new policies and regulations, such as the Vermont Clean Water Act, or Act 64 of 2015. That was included in the plan. Clean Water Service Provider Act, or Act 76 of 2019. That was newly included in the plan. The second thing that we thought was kind of missing from the last one was kind of addressing of groundwater and how non-point source pollution can also affect groundwater, not just surface waters. So yeah, and then a couple other things that were missing included development of initiatives focused on climate change. There's always emerging issues. The PFAS issue, if you're familiar with that, was another emerging issue. The plan expanded eligibility of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to include more non-point source pollution activities. The new plan also talked more about expanding the reporting of state investments and the Lake Champlain Restoration Plan progress. So we have kind of a more robust tracking and accounting system now, and we have a more robust report that we put out annually to the legislature on state investments, and also reporting back to EPA on the Lake Champlain Restoration Plan progress. So that is all very important. The last thing that we thought was important to include is adaptive management. No plan is really complete without some way to kind of change it and update it as you go. So I'll talk more about that later, but that's an important piece of this as well. So what is in the plan? This is kind of a pared down version of the table of contents. There are 9 chapters. I wanted to point out that I did include a link. I realize you probably can't click a link in the presentation. Maybe Rachel could post that link to the chat so you can click on it. Otherwise, it's possible to just Google Vermont Nonpoint Source Plan, and that will bring you to our page on the Clean Water Initiative page under the reports. You can find a copy of it there. It's a rather large document, but if you're interested in scrolling through the document as I kind of talk about it here, that's available to you. But if you're not, if you're like, hey, I'm eating lunch, I just am here to listen, that's totally fine too, because I'm going to go through kind of some of the main larger points from each of these chapters in the presentation today. So here we go. Chapter 1, start there. It kind of goes over what's the purpose. So what do we have? What does this do? Why do we have this? The main purpose is, of course, to establish an overall strategy that the state of Vermont will use when carrying out and implementing the various non-point source pollution control and management programs for the, it actually covers federal fiscal year 2021 to 2025. Federal fiscal year 2021 just started in October 1st of 21 is kind of the start of the scope of this plan. So speaking of scope, to kind of, it is quite a broad scope, actually. The audience, it's really written kind of for the EPA since they require the document, but of course anyone who's interested can view and review it. It attempts to acknowledge all types of non-point source pollution and addressing each of those. How do we address each of those? Yeah, basically summarizing the causes and sources of non-point source pollution. It talks about setting priorities, so prioritizing what are the most pressing non-point source pollution sources. How are we mitigating those? Let's identify strategies, funding resources, and partnerships that will be used to restore impaired surface and groundwaters and to protect threatened waters. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, of course, but that theme of both restoring and protecting waters is seen throughout the document. It also describes 5-year objectives, actions, and milestones towards making progress achieving our longer-term goals of the Non-Point Source Management Program. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of the overall scope of what is in this document. Awesome. Okay, so still kind of thinking big picture about the mission and the goals. The mission, kind of the state of, I guess it's from the perspective of the state of Vermont, the mission is to prevent, control, or abate ground and surface water pollution caused by the myriad of non-point source pollution sources, such that beneficial uses of water resources are maintained or restored. And this mission is accomplished by promoting the implementation, use, and maintenance of effective best management practices through funding and regulatory programs across non-point source agencies. Yeah, so the kind of, if we are looking at the overarching goals for Vermont's non-point source management, they include restoration of waters. Like I said, this is kind of a theme throughout the document. So restoring waters that are impaired by non-point source pollution in order to meet water quality standards, as opposed to the protection of waters, which is focused on preventing, avoiding, or minimizing non-point source pollution related impairments of unimpaired waters. So we want to restore those impaired waters and we want to protect those unimpaired waters. And then the last kind of large overarching goal, targeting of resources. So that's kind of like prioritizing. Let's prioritize where do we put our limited human and financial resources. That's the third kind of large goal or theme of the document. Awesome. So chapter 2, objectives. So objectives are basically how we achieve the goals. And to me, I think this is really the most important part of the document. If you are looking at the document and you want to kind of look at the most important section, I would say chapter 2, it really defines our specific, measurable, and timeline of achieving each of the goals. So how are we going to achieve each of the goals? The chapter is broken up into 4 main categories, of which are the sources of NPS pollution. So the first one being agriculture. I just took a quick clip from the document. One of the objectives under the Agency of Agriculture was to revise the required agricultural practices to kind of tighten them up, make them a little bit more clear. So there's an objective, the actions that you need to do to complete that. The milestones are kind of like, what's the deliverable? What are we going to get out of it? And then when are each of those milestones going to be completed? So this is important. These tables are really important because we will actually report on our progress back to EPA annually on how we're doing with each of these objectives. So looking, the second kind of category that it's broken up into is the stormwater runoff. And that includes kind of, it's the stormwater runoff sections broken up into regulatory stormwater, non-regulatory stormwater. It talks about the objectives, related to, this one is related to, again, I just took a clip, there's many more objectives. This one's related to the operation and maintenance standards and training on that. There are objective tables related to hydro modification. So that being, how are we addressing and preventing stream channelization? How are we addressing dams that are impacting ecosystems and the movement of sediment? How are we addressing functioning floodplains? That's what this one is about. And in addition, we have forest management, kind of making sure that our forestry practices are in line with the best kind of management that we can do. And then the final kind of objective is to basically it's an objective to improve our Nonpoint Source Management Program over time. There's a couple of different things we're working on, improving different financial programs, we're working on improving. Again, this is a snippet. There are many objectives under each table. And if you're interested, certainly take a look. All right, so chapter 3 is really just kind of an overview of the framework of Vermont's Nonpoint Source Management Pollution Program. It talks about the key state and federal programs that we have already in statute. Some of them are old, like the Federal Clean Water Acts, and them are new, like Act 76 and Act 64. It really goes into pretty good summary of each of those laws and rules that are related to non-point source pollution. It talks about how with these rules and laws, generally they are apply statewide. So we are taking a statewide approach to managing pollution, but we're also taking a more targeted approach by looking at individual river basins or individual watersheds and addressing those kind of more specifically. So let me see if I said anything I wanted to. Yeah, the broad nature and geographic scope of non-point source pollution requires that Vermont has a robust regulatory oversight of non-point source management through laws, rules, or other program requirements in conjunction with increasing investments and technical assistance in grants and loans. So there is a lot of information in there. It just kind of touches on what's related to non-point source management pollution that we already have in place. Awesome. So we're on to chapter 4. How is non-point source management pollution threatening Vermont waters? We have, this chapter kind of goes over a little bit of what the Atlas of Vermont, what's the scope of waters that we have in Vermont, over 7,000 miles of streams and rivers, over 300 acres of freshwater wetlands. We're talking about 812 lake and pond water bodies. And then underneath all of that, of course, is the groundwater, of which about 60% of Vermonters use groundwater as their drinking water source. So also a hugely important piece of this. Some of those waters are in really great shape, and some of them are not, and they're impaired by various different pollutants. According to the Vermont Surface Water Management Strategy, which is another document that we kind of refer to in this document, But if you're interested in that, I encourage you to take a look at that that document as well. It talks about the 5 major stressors. Well, I think there's actually 10. There's 10 stressors to Vermont surface waters. But I've just listed the top 5 here. Those being channel erosion. So the erosion that's kind of brought about by human activities and how they're changing the flow, which can lead to a stream being out of equilibrium. There's encroachment, which is the placement of public or private infrastructure on lakes, wetlands, or river corridors, and that can result in the loss of riparian buffer zones and habitat, etc. The third is invasive species. So aquatic species like Eurasian water milfoil and water chestnut, or terrestrial species like Japanese knotweed, they can have severe impacts to the aquatic and terrestrial habitat. And then, excuse me, the 5th major stressor is nutrient loading, which is one we kind of hear about a lot. Oh, did I skip one? Land erosion, or the delivery of sediments off of land surfaces, increases sediments, and absorbed sediments, the loading of those into surface waters. And then the final one is nutrient loading, which you may have heard about, comes from a variety of sources such as septic systems, fertilizer, agriculture. The nutrients of concern in Vermont are mainly phosphorus and nitrogen. So again, there's a lot of information in chapter 4. If you want to know more about kind of what's the status of Vermont's water, there's a great report called the Vermont Water Quality Integrated Assessment Report. It talks about all the different impairments to streams and rivers, lakes and ponds, and how we're kind of basically it shows how we're doing with respect to those pollutants. That's another great document to refer to. Kind of the third thing that chapter 4 refers to is Vermont's major clean water restoration plans, or sometimes they're known as TMDLs. So TMDL, which stands for Total Maximum Daily Load, is the maximum amount of pollutant that a water body can receive and still meet water quality standards. So in a broader sense, it's a plan that identifies the pollutant reductions a water body needs to meet water quality standards. So there can be TMDLs for small water bodies, and there can be very large scale TMDLs. So the map to the left shows the larger scale TMDLs. The two water bodies in green, the Lake Champlain TMDL, and the light green is the Lake Memphremagog TMDL. They are both impaired for phosphorus, so the phosphorus is the main nutrient of concern there. While the Long Island Sound is impaired for nitrogen. So as an example, TMDL, we have put a lot of efforts into the Lake Champlain TMDL. So that TMDL established a baseline of about 631 metric tons of phosphorus are being added to Lake Champlain per year. And that is more than we believe that the lake can handle. So the target total phosphorus load is actually 418 metric tons per year. That's our target, and that's what we're trying to get to using a variety of different at different sources, different investments, etc. So as an example, those are some of the biggest things that we're paying attention to right now. Awesome. All right, so Chapter 5 focuses on, I can kind of speed up, it looks like I am almost already at 30 minutes. The protection and restoration of priority waters. So again, I'll kind of go over what we mean by that. When we talk about protection, we're talking about protecting our already high quality waters. High quality wetlands are our highest quality wetlands are our Class 1 wetlands. Once they're established as Class 1 wetlands, they earn the highest level of protection in Vermont. Our high quality, let's see, we also have high quality lakes and streams, obviously. So for example, Vermont Fish and Wildlife has identified 148 streams that support very high quality cold water salmonoid fisheries. And then DEC's also identified 21 very high quality lakes that provide high quality aesthetics in their natural condition. So these are really important resources for Vermont that obviously we want to protect and make sure they don't become impaired. So the second piece of this is restoration of priority waters. So taking those waters that we know are impaired by a certain pollutant or by a certain cause, it's important to identify those and prioritize them. So we've done that actually in Appendix B of this document. There is a list of prioritized non-point source impaired waters in need of restoration. So I pulled a clip from that. It is kind of shows each water body name, what pollutants are causing an impairment, kind of where is that coming from, do we think? And then is this TMDL a high priority or a medium priority or a low priority? So yeah, that's an important list for us to know and to prioritize so that we can be able to prioritize the most important non-point sources. Awesome. All right, so Chapter 6. Vermont Water Quality Planning and Implementation. This chapter focuses a lot on the 5-year tactical basin planning cycle. Each basin within Vermont, that's shown on the map on the right, is assigned a watershed planner, and that planner is kind of responsible for completing this 5-year tactical basin planning cycle, where there's first scoping and gathering information, then they prioritize target resources, and they develop an action plan, a set of implementation strategies. There's public outreach and awareness associated with this, as well as going ahead and implementing the plan, and finally developing it and ensuring that it gets implemented. So yeah, this is it. I guess this is kind of the planning piece, which is an important piece of the cycle, and it's important to plan, prioritize, assess before you go ahead and just kind of implement things willy-nilly. So yeah, tactical basin planning process, really important. You can definitely learn more about that. If you go to the Watershed Planning Programs website, or talk to your basin planner. Right, so we're on to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 focuses on Nonpoint Source funding programs, regulatory programs, and partnerships. So basically, there are a lot of funding programs, a lot of regulatory programs. I could not even come close to fitting them all onto this slide, so I really just took a couple from the top of the list. And so these are really just some examples of clean water funding programs that are implemented by the Agency of Agriculture, and then also regulatory programs implemented by the Agency of Agriculture. The same with ANR. There's other agencies not listed on here, such as Agency of Transportation, Agency of Commerce Community Development, and then the Agency of Natural Resources, really broken up into several different programs, I guess, that are implementing different regulatory permits, and then different different funding programs that are listed here. There are a lot of programs. I guess what I would suggest is, if you're interested in this more, there is going to be a lecture series in the February Clean Water lecture that focuses on the Clean Water Performance Report. It really takes into account all of these funding programs and shows how our state investments are impacting water quality in Vermont. So I encourage you to check that out. It really kind of, to summarize Chapter 7, shows that Vermont is making, putting a huge amount of effort into funding and regulating non-point source pollution. Awesome. Into Chapter 8, we're almost there. So Chapter 8 talks about how we measure progress. We measure it in a variety of different ways. Of course, we take into consideration different environmental conditions. So what is the role of climate change in measuring progress? We know that we can put a huge amount of effort into implementing different BMPs on the ground, but then we have, for example, a tropical storm Irene come around and kind of set us back a bit. So it's important to take into account kind of the increasing frequency and intensity of storms and how those are playing a role in our progress. How we're kind of handling that is we do track and account for every clean water project that we implement through a funding program and also through a regulatory program. So we're able to at least have a database of our efforts that we've put into maintaining these, to the efforts that we have put into addressing the non-point source pollution. So that's one way. In addition to that, we of course also have surface water quality monitoring. We use a rotational tactical basin assessment as seen in the map. And so we're of course monitoring and assessing basin by basin each of the water bodies, how they're doing. At the same time, we're tracking what our efforts in implementing best management practices on the ground are. So really, we can use this information to evaluate how we're doing. Is it working? In addition to that, there are this chapter also discusses groundwater and drinking water monitoring. Of course, we monitor public and potable and other potable water systems. Super important for drinking water. That's all very closely monitored. There's a groundwater monitoring network in place as well, with different monitoring wells around the state. Yeah, and then the last thing that's important about measuring progress, I think, is evaluating how we're doing and also using reporting as a tool to get the word out to the public on how we're doing and what have our efforts been, and kind of making sure that's an annual process of collecting that information and reporting on it and communicating that to the public is an important piece of this process. So that is generally what we're talking about, Chapter 8, which leads to Chapter 9.
Hi, Helen. Just a quick 10-minute reminder.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
You're good.
I'm almost done. Thank you for the reminder. I just have like a couple more slides here, and I can go quickly. Taking into account what we know from our measuring and monitoring of our progress, we can use that to adapt our processes, adapt our implementation of different programs so that we can really make sure we are using this plan to the fullest. Yeah, really, to summarize, I guess, Vermont's large basin TMDL efforts are influenced in a dynamic manner by environmental, social, and economic factors. For example, each iteration of a tactical basin plan is gets more detailed, more sophisticated. We are doing our best to use the data that we've collected to make programs better, to make policy better, to do better in addressing clean water. So with that, just to summarize, we've got a plan for that, as one politician likes to say. Clean water, we've got a plan for that. And it's all right here at our fingertips if you wish to peruse it. It is, yeah, so I guess the final thing is that the plan was approved by EPA September 22nd of 2020. And then just a little blurb of what EPA said about our plan, which I just wanted to reiterate, is they said, we believe Vermont's program includes meaningful goals and milestones, effective partnerships, and a framework that ensures Section 319 funding, state non-point source funding, technical support, and other resources will be directed to the state's highest priority water quality issues and non-point source watershed projects. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you to, of course, it was not just me who helped develop this plan, but there is a core team of people who worked closely with me to develop this, and then there was many other agency partners that we worked with. Just wanted to say thank you. And then I will leave you also with my email address if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But with that, I can also throw it back to Rachel and Jordan to let me know if you have any questions for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. That was wonderful. Do you mind if I share your face?
Sure.
We do have a couple of great questions in the chat. First question from Peter. What portion or percentage of the Nonpoint Source funding is state money, and what portion or percentage is federal?
That's a great question. The majority of the money that we put on the ground towards clean water projects and planning is state money. There's really the amount, we have a really robust clean water fund, actually, that is now supported by both taxes, state taxes, and the clean water, or the, excess, the bottle bill. It's also supported by when you don't take your cans and bottles back to the back to the recycling, like that leftover money is also contributed to the Clean Water Fund. So we have a robust Clean Water Fund. That's many millions of dollars. The amount that we receive from EPA is really on the order of $2 million. So it's a small proportion of federal dollars compared to what we have with state. And Neil has more information if you're interested. I'm not, of course, an expert on all of the funding, but.
Thank you. Another question is, what portion of the plan is focused solely on Lake Champlain Basin versus the balance of the whole state?
What portion of the plan?
Yeah, of the Nonpoint Source Plan is focused on Lake Champlain versus the balance of the state. I would say there's a pretty good balance. Really, the plan is focused on a lot of statewide efforts. Most of our efforts are statewide, or we talk about the individual basins, but it is statewide. There's really a small section focused on the Lake Champlain TMDL, the Lake Memphremagog TMDL, but really the big focus is what's going on statewide. Thank you. We have a question about this time of year. I always start thinking about road salt use. Does road maintenance, specifically road salt reduction, fall under Nonpoint Source Planning?
Road salt reduction fall under Nonpoint Source Planning. Yes, I would say road salt is a piece of Nonpoint Source pollution for sure. Do we address it directly? We don't have really, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an expert on all aspects of this. It's such a broad scope of work, of course. I don't believe we have any specific programs related to road salt reduction. Actually, VTrans might have some things, but it's not a huge piece of our pollutant source, as far as I know.
Thank you. And we have another comment. Thank you for a great talk. How is climate change incorporated into the plan?
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned climate change a little bit, but Of course, we know that climate change impacts the frequency and intensity of storms. It affects the movement of pollutants. It contributes to all of those kind of environmental stressors that I mentioned. We kind of saw it firsthand when we had Tropical Storm Irene, which really kind of gave us an idea of how to better mitigate for those large events. So things like flood resiliency are very important. And one of the programs we have, we are working on right now is called the Functioning Floodplains Initiative that the Rivers program is heading up in DEC. That is looking at how can we better target, manage our floodplains so that they're more flood resilient, and we can have better resiliency overall. I guess that's kind of a theme of climate change. Yeah, it's really kind of each program does address climate change. In this document, they kind of address it in their own way because it affects different aspects of the natural world a little bit differently. So hopefully that answered the question. Climate change is kind of sprinkled throughout the document, and it's mentioned several times.
Great, thank you. Next, from Dan Albrecht, besides wastewater treatment facilities, what are other examples of point source pollution?
Good question. Other examples of point source pollution. I mean, point sources can be really, we usually we talk about wastewater treatment plants. Point sources could also be kind of illicit discharges, or so that means like if somebody is discharging an unregulated discharge from a residence, or perhaps there's perhaps they're discharging sewage in not an appropriate manner, but really it's not as big of an issue as the non-point sources. So it's really, I guess that's why we focus so heavily on the non-point sources.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Another question in connection to the last question, can you possibly talk a bit about how climate change will cause more septic systems to fail and where in the state this is a particular concern for watersheds? Thinking about which communities should be prioritized for alternative systems. This is from Julia.
Mm-hmm. How climate change will cause more septic systems to fail. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think, because again, I'm not an expert in that piece of that. But of course, we are concerned with septic systems that are near bodies of water, so near septic systems nearby any lakes or ponds, any streams are obviously of particular concern. Yeah, I think which communities could be prioritized. So yeah, I guess that would be my recommendation, although again, I'm not an expert in this area. But I would say that communities around lake shores, any lakeshore in Vermont, or even wetlands, near wetlands, should be prioritized for getting the word out about their septic system, potentially talking to them about upgrading it to a alternative system.
Great. Another question, is there less runoff pollution with paved or gravel roads?
Good question. There is certainly less runoff. There is certainly less kind of pollution with a paved road. It's just more stable. So the actual road itself would not erode away. Whereas if you have a gravel or dirt road, that roadway itself can erode, and then sediment and nutrients can become loose, and that can, so our massive network of gravel roads in Vermont is somewhat of an issue as far as non-point source pollution.
Great. Dan Albrecht followed up with, thank you, maybe discrete industrial facilities that are governed under a permit?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good one. You answered his own question, but yeah, industrial facilities. I was just thinking things like breweries might have a discharge, or other kind of industrial facilities like that.
All right, thank you. I think that is all the questions we have for today.
Yay.
I want to thank everyone for joining us. Maybe people can see. Oh, geez.
You're trying to switch it over?
Yeah, I was going to try to switch it over real quick, but there we go. Thank you everyone for attending. It was really great to have you for our first lecture. I want to just push for the survey. We would really love to have your feedback. We want this to be engaging for everybody, and really appreciate anything that can help us improve our presentations. Also want to put in another plug for our January 7th lecture series. Sorry, my computer is not wanting to cooperate. There we go. Put another plug in for our upcoming lecture on January 7th. Stay tuned for more information on that. A good way to keep up to date is with our e-newsletter, and I can submit a link in the chat for that. And that is all for today, folks. Thank you again, and hopefully see you in a month.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Bye, everyone.
All right, thanks, everyone.